Hiya folks, will it LR Workshop, or maybe that should be Grenadier Workshop. In this 48-hour escapade, I did 18 hours of driving, 13 hours of sleep, 10 hours of Goodwood, of which 3 were with the Grenadier. Big thank you to Ineos for paying for my Goodwood ticket. This video is going to be a bit like a podcast. I don't have lots of footage of the vehicle, certainly I don't have footage underneath, but I will be publishing all the footage separately in a different video with the correct audio anyway, but I'm going to be rambling and trying to offload as much detail as possible that I picked up from my time there. I'll be telling you what I thought of the underneath, how many ECUs it is, how we're going to be able to buy one, and also how we're going to be buying parts, whether this is a car for Africa, some feedback from the test drives this week, and would I buy one? Look at the chapters in the YouTube video so you can jump ahead and backwards and whatever to the different sections that you desire. This is the prototype that had the interior that was used in all the publicity videos and photos we saw recently, and being a prototype, they're actually allowed to drive it on the road, funnily enough, up to 25 kilometers an hour, and they have to use a test driver. This one's chassis number 31 of the 2Bs. We can see on the VIN number here we've got the Ineos have got a new 3-digit prefix, which is SC6. Also from the label we can see the axle weights on this vehicle were labelled 1600 kilos on the front, 2150 on the rear. Naturally I suspect this could change because it's a prototype. Train weight was shown as 7,000 kilos. There are actually 135 of these prototypes made, like this one, and about 15 to 20 of them have been crashed so far. So all of the crash testing is complete, it's been finalised, it's been approved. They did include rollovers in that, and I told them, you've got to publish that footage, you've got to publish the footage of rollover crashes. I don't think NCAP rating requires it, US crashes may require it, but I said in any case, like, publish that footage. That will really, I think, if people could see this thing crash and realise how much tougher than the old Defender it would be, I think that would really convince people like modern is actually good in this respect. I did ask if I could buy one of the prototypes. You know, I want to be part of automotive history for once in a for a change. But they said they would all be scrapped, so that's a shame. By all intents, this vehicle was described as one that wouldn't normally be shown to the public. You know, this would normally be camouflaged up on the road. They're very keen to say this is one of the most quoted things I heard on the day to everyone that came along. Still a year away from delivery to customers, so it's a bit of a privilege. I mean, yeah, a bit of a privilege, but they're being very open with the whole process. I appreciate that, and I think everyone's intelligent enough to realise there's caveats with all of this. So let's move on to the underneath, which is what we're here for. As I said previously, I was asked not to show any of the underneath, so unfortunately I won't be able to show you anything. But I spent about 10 minutes underneath, having a good look around, mentally trying to absorb things in. I've spent hundreds of hours lying on my driveway looking at Defender, so looking at this bit was important to me to understand it. It's a perspective that we haven't had yet. So I'm going to try and describe things in a vague, descriptive fashion that I think doesn't give too much away, but does give you a flavour of what's underneath. And this should be, you know, anyone with a Defender should know where I'm coming from with the kind of things I'm talking about. Bear in mind as well, I've got experience with 70 series Land Cruisers, so that's kind of what I'm comparing this vehicle to when I look underneath. And this is all very subjective. It's me at the end of the day and what I am thinking about when I'm thinking about the underneath. In my other video I said this thing is epic, and part of me was thinking, well, that's going to be easy to work on. And then the other half of me is thinking, why would I need to do work on it? The engineering to my layman eyes is impressive, like literally impressive. You've got to remember that this thing was designed on CAD in the last 5 years or so. The Defender, as we knew it, was an evolution of, you know, design from, let's say, starting with the Jeep in the 1940s, right through the Series 3, add some coils on, maybe the Range Rover. In any case, if it's an evolution of the Range Rover, that's 1970s technology, so this thing looks different underneath. So the suspension setup is something new for us Defender owners. It's a slightly alternative take on coil-sprung live axles from other shots of the bare chassis. That we know that the rear springs are inboard of the chassis rails. So that basically means that you can have stiffer springs to carry the load but then the articulation comes from the leverage effect by the vehicle swinging left to right, and that's where you put more pressure on those springs than they actually give. And then you have an anti-roll bar to then effectively stiffen up the vehicle. So really, it's kind of a balance between hoping you can get a bit of articulation, but also the having the springs that will help carry heavy loads. So an interesting take there. Some of the suspension setup has changed since the first prototypes that we saw in some of the early episodes, like over a year and a half ago. Comparing this vehicle to that, there are different suspension arms between them, not wholly different. One of the fascinating things for me is some of the components in the suspension can be measured in inches rather than millimeters. It's unreal. One of the first pitches given by the staff to everyone that came up was the fact that it didn't have air suspension, therefore it's got less to go wrong. They're really heavily playing on this fact. Another thing that caught my eye underneath, I've never seen 6mm thick metal used in the way it has been. I would say this thing is over-engineered. It's tough. It weighs about 2.5 tons at the moment, and they're going to try and shave about 200 kilos off. That is totally possible. But how they do that without impacting on durability will totally be the question. So payload, really going to depend on how much they can shave off there. But the GVM is 3,500 kilos. Otherwise, underneath the suspension, everything's packaged really nicely. Lots of access to swing a spanner. So you can work on each of the suspension components independently. And the diff fill plugs don't get blocked by anything. The suspension bolts and nuts don't conflict with anything as well. So they've thought about the positioning. The rear shock, I asked specifically, the rear shock top bush is undone via the rear wheel arch, where otherwise it would have been covered because it's inboard of the chassis rail. They've thought about how you're going to easily remove the thing. So it's quite radical in certain places. There's mounting points on axles that I've never seen before. I would say the bush is more than adequate. I've seen there were M16 bolts everywhere. The sway bars, anti-roll bars, they're not designed to be disconnected by the user. That's the thing that people want from the other 4-link suspension vehicle, being the Jeep Wrangler. We were told this vehicle's not designed for four-wheel drive enthusiasts, i.e. people that want to hone and tweak this thing to get the best, flex and articulation out of it. It's not designed for those people, which I appreciate. Maybe in 10 years when these things are second-hand, people will start trying to modify a bit more. But, that sector is not really a big market in places like the UK. The shock absorbers I saw didn't appear to have any particular brand on it. Some people are saying they're Bilsteins, but I didn't see a brand. The steering components are very familiar to those of us with Defenders. The rear lower link to chassis mountings does hang quite low. It hangs below the chassis, but it doesn't hang that much lower than the diff because the chassis is a lot higher than it is on the Defender. I think the earlier prototypes hung a bit lower. I can imagine it has a bit of an impact on the ramp breakover angle, but where it's positioned, slightly, quite far off the centre line and relatively high, I don't see it causing that much of a problem, to be honest. What can I say about the drivetrain? The prop shafts, comparable size to a Defender's. They're not high angle. I reckon they could be more easily removed than a Defender's prop shaft with more simple tools. I don't think the diffs are going to have any pinion bearing problems, put it that way. We asked what the half shaft diameter was, but they didn't know, and likewise they didn't know the spline count. Can't imagine it's going to be lacking. The wheel bearings are taper roller. Assume there's 2 of them. And they don't use a spacer for adjustment like you get on the TD5 onwards on a Defender. So that'll be good. Not sure of the dimensions, not sure if they're the same size as each other, unlike the 70 series. Also, we don't know if it's CV joints or UJs in the swivel housing at the front. And we don't know specifically the diff size or the crown wheel count on the teeth, things like that. The components in the hub area look pretty easy to disassemble, actually. I think they'd come apart more easily than on a Defender. The sealing that I could see around the drivetrain is excellent, and dare I say it, it's quite ingenious as well. I never would have thought of something like that, if I'm honest. I said that having options to upgrade the durability of certain drivetrain components would be incredibly desirable for everyone on the internet, basically. But it doesn't really look to be on the cards at the moment. I hope they do something like that in the future. We asked if the gearbox would work on basic ATF, and they didn't know. They were going to find out for us, but that's kind of like it's a key one, like can you use ATF as a get you home fix, and it's not just going to destroy the gearbox in 50 miles. Focusing on the rest of the underneath, the side steps are beefy, they're bolted to the chassis, and they are strong enough to jack the vehicle on. They are not just to look the part, they are actually structural in that respect. That's impressive, I think. The recovery points, very easily accessible, front and rear. I think the design may need some tweaking, we'll see, it depends how hard they test them. But they're certainly nice and well positioned. There's bash plates, certain areas that are fitted underneath that I think definitely would have been fitted after some of the testing they've been doing. I think that changing the oils in all of the transmission would be pretty straightforward. There's certain components as well they fitted underneath that would be considered aftermarket upgrades on a Defender, so I hope they keep those. There's also some telltale paint on the steering locks, so it looks like they're testing to find what the best steering lock position is, and therefore what the turning circle is. I did ask the test driver how many steering wheel turns is it from lock to lock, and he said it wasn't finalised, and well, not that it wasn't decided, but it just that they didn't have any information that they were allowed to publish yet, so he didn't want to be drawn on that. They have also seriously, and I mean seriously, thought about the noise and heat suppression underneath. I think this is going to be likely to be a very comfortable experience when driving, on the motorway. From the wheel arches, we can see that they've got captive mounting points. We got talked about in another video that were designed to allow the fitment of things like bull bars, for example, so that aftermarket could design bull bars, rhubarbs, particularly the Australian market, and they're pretty beefy there. They've also put some effort, I can see, in underneath to stopping there being rust traps in the metalwork, which is refreshing to say the least. The fuel tank on that prototype was 90 litres. At the moment, it may fall foul of weight reduction, so we don't know if it's going to shrink a bit more than that. I think the only place in terms of additional tanks, whether water or fuel, would probably be under the sills or kind of behind the wheel arches up into the body. It would probably be a bit trickier than on a Defender though, so we'll have to wait and see what happens with that. There's an AdBlue tank as well, and a lot of people expressed concern that it freezes at a relatively warm temperature for really cold climates, but I've been told that it's heated, so hopefully they'll get around that aspect. What was really interesting to me is that there are jobs underneath the Defender that to replace parts that would take hours, and on the Grenadier it would take minutes. That gets me really excited. That's just a massive improvement. Brake calipers are modern and probably the size you would expect. I didn't see a place for a PTO. And what's interesting, there are some plastic brackets underneath, which I didn't expect to see actually. But I did bring it up with one of the guys there, and they said, yeah, it does, but hopefully the testing should decide whether they're adequate or not. The bottom grille at the front is for the bottom of the radiator because it's huge. At the moment, this is because they're testing with oversized radiators and coolers, and then progressively kind of seeing how small they can go. So it has that bash plate over at the bottom. Some people are concerned with that filling with mud. I don't necessarily feel it might do. I mean, I don't necessarily feel that it would get hit in when you're using the departure angle to the extreme, or that it's any more kind of hanging low than a Defender would be in that area. But in any case, it may not be required if the radiator changes size. On these prototypes, the chassis had been quickly spray painted over. You could see the kind of the paint shadows around brake pipes and things like that. So we don't know what the final coating will be. I don't know specifically about galvanized chassis, but I suspect probably not. The body has some galvanizing, but the way this thing is built underneath, it is not going to rust away quickly in any case. I did, funnily enough, spot an identical electrical connector to one that you would find on the TD5. And, there were no leaks yet. I was very lucky to look in the engine bay. The bonnet was not up for long, and they were trying to prevent everyone else having a look inside, but we managed to wangle a look. The engine bay was very obviously still in a prototype phase, but there was a general feel that there was enough space in the engine bay to work on, in and around the vehicle. I mean, there's a lot of plastic covers, it was modern and that, but plastic reservoirs, things like that. I think they looked just like generic things, and they hadn't fully designed what the coolant bottles and fluid containers would look like. They were all black. You couldn't necessarily see which was the clutch and which was the coolant and which was brake fluid, for example. But it wasn't a sea of plastic everywhere. All of the main fluids and important bits were easy to see, accessible, and they were still tweaking the position of things in the engine bay. So, like, for example, they were moving brackets around so you could more easily remove filler caps and things like that. I could at least start to see, I could just envisage the way the engine could be removed. Some vehicles you just look at that and think, I'm going to have to take the body off to remove the engine. But this one, I could at least see how it could be removed. There's a sump plug to drain the engine on, which is good. It means you don't have to use one of those bloody vacuum sucking jobbies and other BMW engines. The oil filter is a paper filter that you put in instead of a metal canister that we're used to. There were lots of loosely connected coolant pipes. Everything was kind of like labelled up, very, very prototype. They're trying to find, as I said earlier, optimum size, but also the optimum number, position of the radiators, things like that. You could tell that they were playing with the position of the radiator and the angle of it. The main radiator that we saw, what can I say? It was not a cheapo job. It was not a cheap thing. Like, that thing almost looked like a work of art in the way it was built. I don't know whether that's just a mock-up or whether the final thing will look like that. But the mountings for it were substantial and reassuring. I said that the Australian market really cares about the cooling efficiency and handling high temperatures. Is really what they care about. So I appreciate they're going to be testing in Australia at some point. There is also an Autobox oil cooler and a large AC condenser as well. Like I said, it's got 500 newton meters of torque, which is twice what a Puma's got. They've specifically focused on improving torque from the engine rather than power, which makes sense for what it's supposed to be doing. There wasn't any interior display of the gears or revs, so the test driver couldn't say anything about rev ranges or what gear it would pull away in on tarmac. But I also get the impression that because it's got a bigger engine, it's got more gears, and it's an auto, the driving's a lot smoother. It will be less damaging to the drivetrain than the manual potentially. And doesn't need to be ragged, to get any kind of semblance of performance out of it. I guess modern, that's the definition of a modern vehicle, really, isn't it? I asked if they could start the engine, but they said they were trying to charge it and didn't have enough battery, so that's probably code for get lost. The electrical systems on the vehicle, they're going to communicate via CAN bus, which is also a pretty modern thing. So, like, for example, headlights are going to be run by the software within the system rather than relays and mechanical switches, for example. And it's going to be designed so that, for example, because all these systems are linked, a failure in the headlight's not going to trigger limp home mode, for example. There are 35 ECUs in this vehicle. New Defender has 85. And I think they're looking at some kind of onboard diagnostics, at least, so it can help us out if there's a problem. 35 sounds a lot, but bear in mind it's probably a loose definition of what an ECU is these days. Just a bit of a small chip that does one thing. One of them will do like airbags, another one will do ABS, traction control, that kind of thing. Another one will run the heating, probably, all these kinds of stuff. One for the gearbox, one for the engine. So they quickly mount up on modern vehicles where pretty much everything's got a sensor. We got the impression the main ECU is above wading height, tending to think that it's on the bulkhead, but trying to rack our brains and can't quite remember. But potentially that would be a fairly standard position for it to go. In terms of emissions, we'll have to wait till the final version because that depends on the weight and the engine tuning. It does look like they're replacing sort of some of the ancillary bits around the engine compared to what it would be fitted in other vehicles, but it was a bit hard to say. And the hydrogen version is on the cards, which a lot of us know about anyway. There's no date set for that, but interesting to note that Ineos make hydrogen as a byproduct of the other businesses. So it kind of makes sense that why wouldn't you build a product that you can sell your byproduct to run, for example. There is a raised air intake. Note, they did say raised air intake, not a snorkel. And it is sealed through the bodywork. The pipes go over one another with an O-ring. There's clips onto the bodywork, so it's not sealed by just sealing up against the body and then sealed from the other side. There is pipe work that goes through the body. In terms of bad fuel, it's a big question that a lot of people are asking. I didn't see what kind of filtration it's had. Didn't get to ask that question really. In terms of like what happens if it's like kerosene or dirty or got a load of water in it. But to be honest, having seen underneath, I think there's a lot of potential for kind of us to fit our own extra filtration if required. And the batteries, not in the engine bay, we were told they were stored under the second row seats, and there's potential for fitting a second one there as well. I'm sure you've all seen there's an off-road button. What does it do? What does it do, Basil? It's not really something they wanted to talk about. There's some kind of mumblings about that it turns off ESC, DSC, dynamic stability control, and ABS. Although I did hear from someone else that they said in low range, traction control and DSC are turned off, in inverted commas. So maybe kind of a conflation between the two. Is it low range? Is it the button that does it? We don't know. They did say that technically, in any cars these days, if there was a DSC off button, it's not actually turned off. It's just kind of in the background. But they kind of said that it'll be there in the background, but it won't really override the driver when you're off-road. For the locking diffs, I was told by one person that they were standard, and then someone else said they were optional. So not really sure where we stand on that. I hope they're optional, because that would at least reduce some of the cost of the base model a bit. They are electrically actuated via a solenoid, and the locking action is within the diff itself rather than on the half shaft. The wading mode button, it basically means that the parking sensors get turned off, front and rear, and then the seatbelt warning light won't bong if you unclip your seatbelt. Which sounds sensible. I don't know if there's anything extra to that, but that was certainly what I was told. I also said the throttle sensitivity changed when it was in low range, and they didn't know because they hadn't known that they were driven at low range. They didn't also know about the crawl ratios on the low range, but the test driver said that first low was fine in the testing that he'd done. And because it's an auto, this is new for me, some of you with autos might know, but it doesn't run on tick over, so you've always got to have driver input on the throttles to get it to go. The ground clearance is probably less than the original Defender. It's not bad. All the components underneath are very well tucked away. They've tried to put everything out of harm's way as much as they can, more so than you'd see in some Defenders. I could easily crawl underneath, which is a big one for me, to be able to get under and say, what's that noise? But the underside, the cross members, gearbox cross member, things like that, were noticeably kind of closer to my chest than on a Defender. Still, there's quite a lot of room to still work though. The approach angle looks similar to the Defender. The departure angle's probably better. We'll see. The ramp breakover is probably a bit less, but don't have any figures for these at the moment. The bash plate at the rear covering the exhaust silencer has been highlighted. A lot of people on the internet, and also through testing. His exact words were, "You are not unique in your concerns," about the fact that it potentially is going to act like a massive scoop when you're going uphill. The wheel arches are quite snug to the tyres actually, so fitting 35-inch tyres is probably unlikely without some modification. They said that fat snow chains were apparently only just clear, so I think 33-inch tyres might start rubbing on the articulation, but bear in mind, as I said before, they're not intending this to be an off-road enthusiast vehicle. They're intending it to be a working vehicle. The steel wheels that I had on were 7.5 inches wide. As I said before, there are no plans for an anti-roll bar disconnect. I'm not seeing any evidence of a tyre pressure monitoring system. It's quite curious as well that they, last year they announced Bridgestone as their tyre partner, but all of the prototypes we've seen have been on BFGs. Maybe it's not ready yet, or who knows. The interior is naturally the thing that's got everyone interested at the moment, so we weren't allowed to touch it or sit in it. They were very protective over it. This is the only prototype that has got kind of the full mock-up of the interior. So I can't describe the driving position, unfortunately. All the other prototypes have got kind of like a more basic version of the interior. So this one's still a mock-up though, so the switches are fake. The grab handle was 3D printed. The elbow rest on the door is going to be changed, apparently. They didn't know where the auxiliary switch connections were going to be terminated yet, although I suspect somebody knows. It definitely feels utilitarian enough for my taste. There were no drain holes in the front footwells on this one, just because it hadn't been built yet. But there were some on the second row. I didn't even consider the fact you could have drain bugs in the second row, and he did show me. The drain bugs, they're quite nice actually, quite sturdy, rigid things. They've got a locking action so they don't pop out. They're not just like a grommet. The depth in the load space is less than the original Defender actually. Probably not as wide as the new Defender either. We did the new Defender commercial. We did go and have a look. There's a direct comparison that, you know, the new Defender's got a lot of underfloor storage, lockable bins, that kind of stuff. But then really, you know, the new Defender doesn't have to contend with a diff flying up and down underneath it. There may be a more boxy version of the low space trim. This one's quite rounded, makes it a little bit more like a car, but I think they're going to be looking to make something a bit squarer so that stuff doesn't start sliding off. The load space will be able to take a Euro pallet when the seats are down, apparently. Something along the lines that the station wagon seats won't go totally flat, but the two-seat commercial will. I think they're going to bring the rear floor up a bit in the commercial to have the cargo racks in there. I'm not sure that sleeping in the back would be great. You know, we'll have to wait and see. I mean, it's a bit tight for me in a Defender station wagon. I can't stretch my legs out. This looks a little bit shorter than that. The Grenadier's also got pre-positioned brackets or kind of bracket cutout things up in the roof. So you can have a dog guard, cargo barrier, whatever you want to call it, behind each row of seats. So behind the driver and passenger, behind the second row as well. There's also an extra bracket with some holes in there. They appear to be riv nuts. We couldn't see any threads, but if it does, that would make it, you know, incredibly useful for like putting in cargo shelves and things like that. There's tie down loops all over the place, on the side, different heights. The ones in the floor are recessed, so you know, it really makes it easy to put something flat and then clamp it over, you know, the whole face of the object. There's a charging point in the rear. The placement's a little odd at the moment because it's, if someone was in the back, you wouldn't be able to access it that easily from the door. There are charging points for the second row and the front row charging points. I believe I've seen photos. They're in the cubby box. So I imagine you put your phone inside the cubby box, put it on charge, and then use Android Auto or Apple CarPlay on the main screen to then run your phone from there, which is what they're intending to do with running the kind of navigation and things like that. Stops the phone falling around, which I can see the benefit of actually. You put your phone away, you don't need to get it out anymore. I don't know if they're USB or 12 volt cigar socket, but I can't imagine they wouldn't be USB in this day and age. The seating position in the second row is actually very similar to a Puma Defender. Similar kind of rake on the seats, similar kind of depth, similar kind of legroom as well actually. And you've probably got the same sort of vision when looking out the windows. There's quite a lot of venting, substantial venting at the rear, which is good. We've never had that on a Defender. The front seats have got under-seat storage that's accessed from the outside. I really like this. It's secure when you're in. You've shut the door and it's secure. It's not going to fall out. And then when you get out, it's just right there waiting for you. You can just grab it and use it. I think it'd be a good place for things like gloves, work gloves. You need that, or tire pressure gauge, or whatever it may be. The red stop buttons you can see are just part of the prototype requirement. There weren't any moonroofs on this vehicle, so I don't know if they have shade or anything like that. The accelerator's hinged at the bottom, like our American cousins are used to. There are going to be different trim levels, for example, plastic steering wheel, and they're aiming to make the Recaro seats standard on all vehicles. So this interior mock-up we see is probably the fully featured one. The high-low diff lock lever, interestingly, it's got a sleeve on it like some cars do for reverse gear. I don't know if the steering wheel's heated. It has cruise control and DSC. Unsure about automatic emergency braking and lane assist, but it does have sensors in the front bumper. Can't imagine why you wouldn't have those these days, because it's a software thing. But I guess it depends if it's able to control the steering, which possibly not. I didn't see any particular space for adding VHF radios, although there may be something in the cubby box that you could do. I didn't get a chance to see the under second row storage because we couldn't touch it, unfortunately. And there's not been any talk of a 7-seater version either. It has an inverter with a mains plug socket, which I don't know if is an option, but you could see that in the bottom of the second row where the other charge points are. There will be some kind of speedo reading in front of the driver. In this prototype, there was nothing at the moment, but is it a requirement that there's something that the driver can see in terms of speed in front of them? Speakers are quite low down on the doors, but the door seals will be very waterproof. I can't imagine there'd be a problem in normal use with those those speakers getting wet. So this prototype was an interior prototype, not an exterior prototype, I was told. So there's probably likely a few bits that are liable to change on here. Overall, it's a very similar size to a Defender, maybe slightly lower roof, perhaps you can kind of tell. The body shell sits on rubber mounts that connect to the chassis. The doors can be easily removed, looks like it. When they're open, you can access captive bolts. The outside of the hinges also have got bolts, and I assume they can be removed. Whether they can be removed easily like a Defender door can be stolen, I don't know, but I assume they're real. There are dual door seals on the door and on the body, so I think sealing for dust, water is going to be fantastic. There's a few wobbly plastic panels. The wings are plastic, and some of the rear kind of quarter-light trim is a bit plastic, but I think it's just the prototype. The wings, at least, even in their current form, will be strong enough to stand on. Not much deflection when I pushed on them. The bonnet, for example, as well, on this prototype was plastic. The wheel arch eyebrows, they're tough and slightly rubbery. So kind of like the Defender soft A-bar was that you could get for the front as an accessory. The cutout toolbox thing at the rear on both sides, they were designed to be external cubby holes, but they're going to be removed on the final model and then will be accessible from the inside instead. The windscreen wiper snow trough is not necessarily finalised, so don't worry about that too much. The doors open and close really nicely. A very traditional door button with a very firm action, nice clicking noise. Sounds very similar to the old Defender, actually. The rear doors at the back are confidence inspiring. The little barn door's nice. It's got the same handle as the other doors. There is some adjustment in the mechanism that you can see if it slackens off over time. On this vehicle, though, the little door didn't shut properly, but there we go. It's a prototype. There was no gas strut on the main rear door, but I have seen that on other prototypes. We looked at the door, the metal, the thickness of the metal that makes the doors, and it was in some places it is at least 2 millimeters. That's the same as a Defender's chassis, pretty much. Most of the fasteners we saw were Torx screws. There's a few hex head bolts, some flanged Allen screws, but I was told that one of the last tasks that they will happen for the vehicle is a rationalisation of fasteners. So they'll go around and try and make things as much the same as they can. I imagine it will be Torx, if I'm honest. The liners in the wheel arches pretty much fully cover the arch, and they're held in with substantial fixings, which is a breath of fresh air for us as Defender owners. The wing mirrors are designed the way they are because apparently they've got to meet requirements, legal requirements based on the size and weight of the vehicle. The filler flap, fairly straightforward. It's a bit flappy at the moment, but there we go. Now the roof, it's designed not to need a roof rack, so the gutters don't need to be tough. It can take 150 kilos as it is out of the factory. It's got rubber mounting strips along the top. They're not cargo tracks. Hopefully they'll be able to be replaced without having to remove the headlining from underneath, because I couldn't see how they were fastened from the top, and hopefully they won't be just stuck on with a bit of glue. Grab handles along the side of the roof, they are substantial. They feel like they're hollow, but there's no deflection when I was trying to rock the vehicle. The drainage channels clearly aren't finished yet. The rear door looms were getting pinched by the doors, so it just sort of shows you how the prototypes are put together. You leave the little stuff to the end. This thing's not designed to need a roll cage because it's got rollover protection built into it, in terms of the way it's been designed and the type of metal they've chosen. This means probably it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to remove the roof and modify the vehicle without affecting the crash structure in some respect. The rear light assembly, a lot of people don't seem to like the rear lights, but they're quite sturdy. I don't know how it attaches on, but the front headlights are LED. They've got Grenadier written on them. In general, it doesn't really feel much wider than the Defender. It's about 20 centimetres wider than the Defender, but it doesn't really feel like it. I suspect they've kept the driver's doors in the same place and then kept the drivers and the seats in the same place and then moved the doors outwards for crash protection and a bit of comfort as well. There was no mention of an extended version of the same models, but there will be a crew cab pickup on launch, and that's going to have a longer wheelbase. The bumpers are plastic, very flexible, a little bit flimsy perhaps, but there's probably a requirement of pedestrian safety, and they are going to be market specific, so not every market will have it fitted. And they're designed in 3 pieces. So, for example, if you hit one of the corners, which is quite a common area to hit a bumper, you'll only have to replace the bit on the corner, not the entire bumper. which is quite refreshing. And it's also designed that you can fit a winch to the chassis fairly easily. The loading kind of cargo rails on the outside, we don't know what the load rating is, they didn't know, but they're kind of an ISO standard fitting. Colours of the paintwork aren't known for the moment, but I expect it's probably going to be at least grey, white, blue and black, because that's what we've seen all the prototypes on. The ladder on the rear door, it's very sturdy. It's fixed in 6 places. This thing, yeah, it's not going to come off. That's it for part 1, folks. Stay tuned for part 2, where I talk a bit more about the testing regime, how we're going to get our hands on the parts, what the warranty is, how they're going to sell them, and what I finally think of this vehicle. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.